Serious, people who almost died, but lived because of a gut decision. What's your story? I went to my urologist with epididymitis. He found the smallest amount of detectable blood in my urine, on a whim. He sent me to have an IVP. They put dye in your blood and radiologist has a look. He saw a mass on my left kidney. 20 minutes later I knew I had cancer when I saw the blood supply to the mass. That was on Thursday. Test Friday. Monday he took out my kidney with a grapefruit-sized stage 3 tumor. There was no margin. Many years later my wife told me the doctor told her that I had a 50-50 chance of living 6 months. That was 1992. Lucky me. When I was 14 my cousin and I found my uncle's gun stash in his closet. My cousin grabbed a pistol and pointed it at my head with his finger on the trigger. I quickly told him to stop and that's not funny. He glared at me and told me it's not loaded while he pointed it at the floor and pulled the trigger. Gun was loaded and blew a big hole in the floor. I think about this a lot. I brought it up once to my cousin and he started to cry. That experience cut us both deep. One time working at a grocery store at night, I had cart duty and had to collect all the carts from the parking lot and bring them into the store. It was dark out and I had my headphones in, and I was looking at the ground and pushing a chain of carts, when suddenly it got darker. I stopped for a split second to wonder how it could get darker when it was already night and bam. One of the huge 30+ feet high parking lot lights smashed onto the ground right in front of me, hit the carts and missed me by 2 feet. The metal had rusted out and it snapped at the base. If I hadn't stopped to wonder how it got darker I would have definitely died. About 10 years ago, my mom and I stopped at Taco Bell for lunch. I was driving and she was the passenger. I parked my pickup truck with my front end facing the street, in front of an electrical post. I thought we were eating in, but my mom said no, let's order to go. She told me what she wanted and said she'd wait for me in the truck. For some reason, I just did not want to leave her there. I was insistent that she come in with me. What if I get the order wrong? I said, come on, just come in with me. Mind you, I was like 20 to 21 at the time, plenty old enough to go in a restaurant order on my own. But something just told me she had to come too. She relented and came in with me. I had just barely finished placing the order when I heard a strange sound outside behind me. The cashier taking my order looked outside right after returning my debit card and says, wow, that crash looks bad. I turned around and it turns out that a drunk driver, at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday, zoomed down the wrong side of the road and slammed into the post I was parked in front of. The driver died on impact. The post collapsed and crushed the cab of my truck on the passenger side. Needless to say, I lost the pickup truck but kept my mom. Nothing spectacular, but I worked for 3 weeks in a fishing boat, prawns. We would collect and throw creels which spanned a mile long, so you can imagine that there was a lot of rope on board. So I was new to this job, and while I am throwing off a big chain that's tied to the spoils of rope, I kinda get an off feeling that my foot was in the wrong place. I look down and it's in between one of the spoils. If I hadn't have removed my foot it could have dragged me off the boat and pulled me underwater. I was traveling in the Philippines in northern Luzon. That's the part always hit hard by typhoons. It was just the beginning of rainy season. I was in Banaway and was planning to go up north to Sagada the next day, Saturday. The Lonely Planet writes about this route as the scariest road in the world. It's solid mountain on one side, and deep on the other. There was a jeepney scheduled in the morning and one in the afternoon. Everyone who knows me knows that I'm not a morning person, and if there is a later option, I'm definitely taking this one. On a whim the night before I decided to leave earlier and take the 8 a.m. jeep. Super out of character for me, and I'm still not sure why I did it. A few days later, on another bus, I chatted with this nice lady and she asked me what places in the Philippines I've been to so far. And she says, OMG, have you heard about the jeepney accident on Saturday afternoon on the road from Banaway to Sagada? So apparently the jeepney I planned to take came upon a mountain slide, lost control and went down the side of the mountain. 10 people died. No one survived. If it was a gut decision so much as just being knowledgeable and acting. But still I think it is a pretty wild instance of a near-death experience. My family and I were on holiday in Thailand over the Christmas period years ago and were staying in a hotel close to the beach in Phuket. I was only 7 and my 2 brothers were even younger. We had been bugging my parents to go jet skiing for days on end, much to my parents' annoyance. But on Boxing Day they finally relented. After breakfast we went down to the beach to have a look around for somewhere to find a jet ski rental, but before any of that could happen my dad, a surfer of many years, saw the tide receding in a way that was completely unnatural and recognized the coming tsunami. We thought he was full of it, but he was deadly serious, so we raced back to the hotel where we considered running for the hills, but on the consultation of another couple that recognized the impending disaster, decided to sit tight in our building, which was relatively short and stout, plus we were on the top floor. Sure enough, that tsunami came and bulldozed Phuket. Although it only destroyed the lobby of our building, we were safe. I have no doubt we all would have died if my dad hadn't known the early signs of a tsunami. We were also on Phi Phi Island a couple days before that, and if we had been there on Boxing Day instead we might well have died too. Just an all-round crazy experience that I'm lucky to have made it out of. My mom. I was almost 15. I had put on a lot of water weight and she was worried about it. Finally, I was in pain and she realized it was literally just water weight, so took me to the hospital. First ER was like, oh yeah, it's just thyroid. Take this and follow up with your doctor. Mom waited a few hours but felt uncomfortable. So she drove me to another ER who told her if she hadn't gotten me in when she did, I would have died before the follow-up. My kidneys had failed. I'm better now. In high school at a graduation party, I had a really bad feeling about the guy me and my friends had gotten a ride there with. I'll call him H. I didn't know him well, but I saw him drinking and wasn't sure how much. He was supposed to be our ride home when the party was over. My one friend said she trusted him and not to worry. Well, I couldn't tell myself not to worry like she could. I said again to her that I didn't think it was safe to drive home with him. She insisted it was fine. Meanwhile, I had made a new friend that night. The first time I saw him, I felt like I should talk to him. Turns out he drove there alone and was staying sober to drive home. By 5 a.m. everyone was talking about grabbing an after-party coffee and some snacks. People were piling into cars. I told my friend one last time I wouldn't drive with H. I got in the car with my new friend, knowing he was 100% sober. We pulled out onto the country road. As it snaked through the trees, H came speeding out and passed us way too quickly. As we drove around the next corner, we went through a cloud of dust and debris. H's car was wrapped around a telephone pole. 2 of the 4 passengers were dead, including the kid who got in the seat I would have been in. My friend was alive but has permanent injuries to this day. Edit. I appreciate everyone listening to my story. Please don't drink and drive. Please help your friends realize how much damage it can cause. Gut decision A. I had a change in my bowel movements. Went to the doctor, got screened for colon polyps, and had a huge one removed. It would have eventually turned into cancer. Scopes aren't fun, but they save lives. I was drinking and felt something stick in the back of my throat. I almost forced it down because it was really far back and awkward to cough up, but I decided to spit it out anyways. It was a shard of glass from the bottle I was drinking out of. It still creeps me out to think about even years later because I really was just going to swallow it. In 1976, I was on vacation with my parents in Colorado and we drive through Big Thompson Canyon. My mom, brother and I all wanted to stay at one of the little hotels within the canyon, but my dad said no, and we continued on our way home to Illinois. After we got home, we saw on the news that the canyon flooded, killing over 100 people. Had we stayed there, we would have probably been killed too. In 2016, my wife and I were in Berlin to explore and visit the Christmas markets. The plan for that evening was to go out to eat and then get the train back to stop into the markets at Breitscheidplatz as it was close to our hotel. This had been the plan for the entire trip as it was the last night. We had finished our meal and were headed to the train station. Just as we were about to board the train, my wife decided that she didn't want to go to the markets at Breitscheidplatz and would prefer to double back to a smaller one we had passed on the walk from the restaurant to the station. I, being a stubborn prick, didn't want to change the plans, but she got her way and we headed back, staying at the smaller market for about 30 minutes. After finally getting the train back, we got off and walked towards our hotel. After a minute or so there appeared a seemingly never-ending stream of emergency vehicles. Not knowing what was going on, but obviously something serious, we speeded up and locked ourselves in the hotel room. We had the English language 24 news channel on, and after about an hour, reports started to come through about a terrorist attack. A man had driven a truck into a crowd at the Breitscheidplatz market. Obviously I'll never know if we would have been in the exact spot, but we definitely would have been there at the same time, and I am never allowed to complain about my wife changing her mind, ever again. I was out late one night. My car had broken down in the middle of an interchange that was so deserted there was no one there for miles. I did what any other person would do and called a towing number, and when I finally got through it was almost 1 a.m. I decided to go take a piss down at some bushes when suddenly I heard some bikes approaching the car. I wanted to head out immediately to stop them for help when my legs froze and I thought twice. From behind the bush I basically saw them try to ransack the car, and apparently they were all armed. Thank goodness I remained still because these guys meant business. They fired multiple shots into the windscreen and door. It was an old Toyota Hilux, so there was nothing in there. They busted all 4 wheels with bullets before getting back on their bikes and zooming off. I believe they were all high AF, which was why they didn't bother to check around, or maybe they thought I just deserted that area. Long story short, I walked a bit further into an open field and sat on the thick branches of a tree where I could see approaching objects. The towing truck didn't get there until past 4 a.m. in the morning, and I can tell y'all that was the longest night of my life. I made it home in one piece. Had been bleeding and in pain for a month, and every time I went to the doctor they brushed me off and said I was having a miscarriage. Finally one night I got super dizzy all of a sudden and was in even more pain. My boyfriend at the time kept telling me I was fine and to go to sleep. Finally at 1 in the morning I drove myself to the ER. I had a tubal pregnancy and my fallopian tube had ruptured and I was bleeding internally. Now I trust my gut feelings and tell everyone else to screw off. I read your first sentence and instantly thought, ectopic. Mine was finally diagnosed at 13 weeks. I had been in and out of doctors for the previous 10 weeks with excruciating stomach pains and continual brown spotting, interspersed with moments of jeweled bright red blood, like perfect red. Never before seen anything that shade of red coming out of me. Quietly sure I was pregnant, because I felt different. We were trying to conceive, and I had come off the pill 3 months prior. Doctors would ask if I could be pregnant. I would explain that we were having a go at it, and I had stopped the pill at the beginning of the year. Doctors would give me a stick to piss on. Tests always came back negative. Doctors would tell me it was just my body getting used to not being on the pill and it all settled down soon. At 12 weeks I finally got a positive test. Yay. Pregnant. I'm right. But worried. Questioned the doctor about the agonizing pain and the bleeding. Was told it was normal. Okay. Question mark. Preggy appointment the next week. Told the obstetrician of my woes. 30 minutes later. Vaginal ultrasounds. An empty uterus and a mass in my left tube. Ambulance to hospital. Emergency surgery in one less tube. My wee baby had died at around 8 weeks, and my body was now sealing up my fallopian tube around it. Fun fact. Turns out, ectopics often return a false negative on a urine test. It was not an enjoyable way to learn this. I was riding my bike to school as normal when I was about 12 and I stopped at a crossing. All the cars stopped, but I felt that something was off and waited a little longer. As soon as I started to cross, there was a flash of green as a Range Rover speeded past me barely a hair from the front wheel of my bike. If I had started to cross sooner, then I would have been hit head on and most likely not have survived as the car was going that fast. I was so shaky that I turned round and headed home explaining to my mom what happened. As I was still shaking, she believed me and made me a hot chocolate while fishing on a large lake in Canada. We were a little more than halfway across when the wind really started picking up and a storm started rolling in. I had the choice to turn back or head to an island with a bay. I decided to head for the bay, and just as we reached the calmer water we looked behind us and the storm had gotten worse. We were in an aluminum boat, and if we had chosen to head back, 3 of us would have drowned. No doubt in my mind, we were already taking on water and were completely drenched when we beached on the island. Once the storm abated, we made the journey back, and it still took 4 hours in high wind for a normally half-hour boat trip. Warming up in the truck was the best feeling in the world after that. When I was 12 years old, I went to stay back in my hometown. We had moved to a town 3 hours away, with a friend and his family. They rented canoes and we trailered them to a spot in the Cedar River. We were going to put these canoes in and float back into town, and get off the river before the multiple low-head dams that are in downtown Charles City, Iowa. This was in 1993, the year of the massive floods. Other rivers were already out of their banks across the Midwest. The Cedar River had been less affected, but on this day it was flowing by at an alarming rate. I had broken my arm a couple weeks prior, and was in a cast. As they prepared to launch these canoes, I began to protest. I didn't want to get in the river. A guy that was camping nearby approached and asked what we were doing. He said the river had come up several feet since he had woke up, and that my friend's parents were fools to try and get in it. They dismissed him, but I continued to refuse. Eventually a park ranger arrived and said that if we even made it to Charles City, we'd never get off the river and would be killed at the first dam. They finally reloaded the canoes, but they were pissed at me for being such a pussy. I think I saved us all. The river came out of its banks that day and flooded Charles City. A suicidal kid tried to kill himself by crashing into my car head on. At the last second I veered right, US, and jumped the curb. He was still able to adjust and smack me pretty good, but nothing like a head-on collision. I'm not sure I would have died, but my gut kept me from being raped. Unfortunately, my friend didn't listen to me and suffered for it. I grew up in a small town who contracted a construction project to a company in Norway. At the local bar one night was a group of Norwegian men who were staying at a local hotel. My friend and I met them that night for the first time. We hung out with them for a few hours and they showered us with drinks all night. At closing time they invited us to continue the party at their hotel. I pulled my friend aside and told her we shouldn't go. We didn't really know them and we were also outnumbered. She said it would be fun and no big deal. My gut told me no. I just didn't feel comfortable, and so I refused. She called me a buzzkill and went anyway. The next day she called screaming at me. She spent the night being gang raped by these creeps, and in her devastation, she blamed me for not going with her. I tried to comfort her. I begged her to let me call the cops. She refused and said she never wanted to see me again. This was a couple decades ago, long before Me Too. I didn't know what to do. One of my biggest regrets is not calling the cops or banging down her door and trying to offer comfort. What I don't regret is not going with her. She can be mad at me, but I couldn't have saved her. We would have both ended up being raped. I moved away shortly after and I've never seen her again. I wonder if there is anything I should do now. I just don't know what that would be. She was dead set on blaming me, but I tried to tell her it wasn't safe. I really did. Edit, I felt crazy guilty, but the decades have helped me come to terms that it wasn't my fault. I don't think I made that clear, but I felt I should add it because it's the truth. When I was younger, a friend of mine offered me a ride home on his motorcycle. I declined because I was staying a bit longer. He got hit by a drunken driver and died on impact. I could have been on the back of that motorcycle. Just last week, I was driving in my car with my friend. We were at a red light and it turned green. I was going to make a right turn but I hesitated. My friend said, "You've got a green light. Go." I don't know why I hesitated, but just as I started to go, a big box delivery truck ran right through the light. She was like, "Damn, we're so lucky." Former professional motorcycle instructor here. I was riding a motorcycle at night on Highway 17 in Northern California, an infamously dangerous and twisty mountain pass with low visibility around most corners. Each direction of the highway has 2 lanes. For no particular reason, I decided to change lanes. Around the next corner, there was a washing machine in my original lane that was only visible after it would have been too late to avoid. At highway speeds, a collision like that would have sent me to the hospital with life-threatening injuries. That one still messes with my head. Few years ago went on a trip to Cuba and Mexico. Last minute decided to stay longer in Havana despite mess that Hurricane Irma has left behind. Few days without electricity was actually oddly amazing. We were supposed to be flying to Mexico City. Our Mexico City Airbnb building collapsed during earthquake. There was no logical reason behind our decision about staying. I just proposed it and my partner agreed. Crazy. Had a weird feeling something was seriously wrong with me when I stood up and almost passed out at a big football game. We left the stadium and went to the ER. Turns out my appendix was ruptured and I needed surgery ASAP. I had been having stomach pain prior to this but brushed it off as digestion problems. Good thing I went. Edit. We were watching the Cotton Bowl in Texas. My wife got me tickets for Christmas as the college we went was playing the year. We are from Michigan, so we had quite the drive to get to Texas. My appendix ruptured in the third quarter and I ended up finishing the game in the hospital. We stayed a few extra days, but I had to get back to college, so my wife drove 17 hours straight, and we had to get out of the car every 45 minutes to an hour so I could walk around to avoid blood clotting. She was my fiancée at the time, and this trip really made us stronger, and I knew we would have a happy marriage. Thanks for all the well wishes. Friends invited me to play games at another friend's house in the burbs, but we both lived near downtown. I normally jumped at the chance to go hang out, but this time I was just off. I thought about going and then texted and changed plans, even though I wasn't planning anything else, just to be at home. They texted at close to midnight to show their back seat touching the back of their front seat. They were rear-ended on the highway going 75 and the guy was going fast enough to smash the entire back of the car in. Luckily I wasn't in it. I'm not sure we would have died, but it wouldn't have been pretty. We had a fire going in the backyard at a friend's house. My friend's dad decided to burn some junk from the garage, mostly old boxes and papers and stuff. So we're helping feed that stuff into the fire. I grabbed the next small box to throw in and I can tell there's something in this one. There had been stuff in most of them, but it was always just pamphlets and little bits of packaging, so we had stopped really checking and were just throwing them in. Well, I'm standing there with the box over the fire about to drop it when I decide to check this one. It was full of live mortar shell fireworks. My friend's dad decided we had burned enough garage junk at that point. Mid-1990s, traveled to northern New Jersey with a friend from college. It was his hometown. We had plans to visit New York City and see a former roommate who graduated the year before, friend 2. Well, apparently friend 2 dabbled in low-level organized crime since his last years in college. We had some knowledge of this but were not involved. He invited us to an associate's house with plans to go out afterward. We declined. Not our scene. In fact, both of us had applied to law school. I planned to pursue a career in federal law enforcement thereafter. We both wanted distance from that nonsense. We tried the following day to reach our friend 2 for a low-key lunch before heading out of town. No answer. Well, local police found his body 2 days later, along with 2 other bodies, at the house to which he invited us. He was murdered at the meeting. Social situation. Could have been us too. I knew that was bad news. I have Crohn's and colitis, so severe gut pains were nothing new. I stood up and felt like I was stabbed in the stomach. I went and told my boss I had to go home. By the time I got home I could barely stand up. My wife insisted I get checked out. She ended up driving and every single pothole was unbearable. We live on a dirt road 40 minutes away from the hospital. I could hardly walk by the time we got there. Turned out I had a ruptured ulcer through both sides, technically a perforated colon. After a week of 4 antibiotics I was released. After a few days at home on antibiotics I woke up one day feeling terrible. Back to the hospital. The perforation had closed but turned into an abscess. They took this 2-foot needle and stuffed it in through my side to install a drain in the abscess. Spent another week on 4 antibiotics while admitted. I was out for a week and had the drain removed, still on antibiotics. A few days later I woke up sick as a dog and went back to the hospital. I had developed a septic infection. Time for a colon resection. They split me from my pelvic bone to my sternum and removed a little over a foot of my colon. 10 days later had a PICC line put in for antibiotics and 4 nutrients. Another 6 days I was released. I spent 26 days in the hospital and out of work for 4 months. Scar tissue from Crohn's was the cause of the tear. Due to the amount of radiation from all of the scans I've had. Cancer is how I go out. 2 years post-op with an ileostomy. I feel great. Other than the bag situation, life is good. In short, a literal gut feeling almost killed me.